Hello and welcome. This is Wilrens for Create a Learning Site, the place to go deeper in your understanding of the Bible. I am launching a project that will take me several issues to complete. The subject is a big one, what some people refer to as the violence of God in the Old Testament. Gregory Boyd has written a very thick book about this, The Crucifixion of the Warrior God, over 1400 pages, and I've been asked for my opinion, and this has led me to undertake this project. This recording is the first installment. I'm not starting with Boyd's book. I first want to do some study of my own and read a bit more broadly. I begin with the Conquest, as you can see here, the siege of Jericho. First, because it is a subject of more manageable size, and second, because at least to the modern mind, the Conquest is perhaps the most shocking example of violence in the Old Testament. Did God really command the Israelites to kill every Canaanite who came within reach of their swords? This project is an adventure. I don't know where it will take me and what my results and conclusions will be. My aim is not only to assess Boyd's book, but also to think through the issues and develop my own position. Several books have been my dialogue partners for this first installment. If you want to know which ones, and also if you want to know the complete reference for Boyd's book, you'll have to head over to the website at wilrens.org, where the relevant titles are listed, and there's an annotated bibliography with a brief discussion of each title. So what's the problem? Well, the conquest of Canaan seems to have been a violent affair. Israel is commanded by Moses not to leave anyone alive, but according to Deuteronomy 20, devote them to complete destruction and to show no mercy to them. That's Deuteronomy 7. And this sits uneasily with the message of the New Testament, where we are told that the very essence of God is love, and where Jesus tells us to love our enemies and bless those who persecute us. I think that qualifies as a problem. One crucial word, Hebrew word, appears in both Deuteronomy passages, cherem. Actually, there are two words, a noun and a verb, based on the same root, but to simplify things, I will consistently speak of cherem. Cherem is a difficult word to translate. Perhaps I will return to the question of its precise meaning in a future issue. It does not always have overtones of destruction. It can simply mean to devote something. And so it has cultic connotations. That is, it belongs to the context of worship and sacrifice. In other cases, though, especially in connection with the conquest, it appears to imply destruction, either by fire or by the sword, and therefore a common translation is to devote to destruction. It should be noted, however, that this entails substantial interpretation. The German translations I work with are more cautious and speak of a ban, to place something under a ban of some kind, leaves more room for interpretation. So, to devote to destruction, God wants the Israelites to devote people to destruction. I guess that adds to the problem. In this recording, I will start with a number of preliminary considerations. List some possible answers, and finish with some relevant passages from the Torah, the 5 books of Moses. Preliminary 1. It is not uncommon for people to speak of genocide when debating the Israelite conquest of Canaan. Genocide is a conscious attempt to destroy a people in whole or in part. It's a heinous crime. My title for this issue speaks of the Canaanite conquest, not genocide, and this is deliberate. First, the term genocide was not coined until the mid-20th century. It seems ill-conceived to project it back into the past and onto texts that are a few thousand years older than this concept. Doing this imposes a Western 21st century conceptual framework on texts, which is arrogant, first of all, and also guarantees poor interpretation and a failure to understand what's really going on. Second, this answers the question before it can be properly asked and processed. If it was genocide, it was evil, pure and simple. What do we know about what actually happened, and what do the relevant texts actually say? Do the events even come close to what we today might consider genocide? I think we should investigate before we engage in moral condemnation. We may be in for a surprise. Okay, a few more preliminary considerations. Virtually every time, both before and after Israel crossed the Jordan, the attack was initiated by others. The exception is Jericho, but for instance, when the kings Og and Sihon were asked for permission to pass through their territories, they attacked and the Israelites defended themselves. The relevant texts indicate that not all that much killing took place. Large numbers of Canaanites continue to live in the area under consideration. Clearly, no genocide was actually perpetrated. And then it was possible to make peace with the Israelites, as the Gibeonites did. Admittedly, they had to take recourse to some trickery, but the interesting thing is that God does not utter any complaint about Joshua's covenant by mistake with those he should have, exterminated? The only ones who grumble are some of the Israelites, not God. Of course, tough questions remain. These considerations do not excuse or explain everything, but they do help. In addition, two more general considerations. In evaluating the conquest with its language of destroying or killing Canaanites, we quickly run into a catch-22. Was this right? And therefore, we need to find a way to justify God? Or was this wrong? But what then do we make of the Old Testament? Either we relativize Scripture. God wouldn't say that or do that. We cannot have ordered the slaughter of women and children. Or we end up with a harsh theology in which God is capable of ordering actions that shock most people. It's not easy to find a way out. And then, second consideration, we are dealing with an unfolding and progressive revelation. God started to work with humans within their world and on their moral and developmental level. This is called accommodation in theology, sometimes condescension. God did not reveal everything all at once. Much he left in place. He adjusted his revelation so that people could understand. Consequently, he condoned much that falls short of his will or truth, for instance, slavery and polygamy. Accommodation also played a role in the sacrificial system. Does God really want animal sacrifice? And the purity regulations. We can clearly see this principle at work in the Old Testament law, but also elsewhere in the Old Testament. For instance, war was normal. It took a while for some of the prophets to think that maybe it shouldn't be. Isaiah 2, Micah 4. So, in assessing violent material in Scripture and seeking to understand it, it is crucial that we keep these three in mind: progressive revelation, accommodation, and condoning. It still won't be easy to put the pieces together. For one, even making generous allowance for accommodation, can God order the killing of women and children? Did he even do that? Before we investigate, let's survey a number of possible answers. 1. This was wrong. Based on what is revealed of God's character in the New Testament, God cannot have ordered mass killings, nor can he approve of them. So, did Israel misunderstand or distort God's intent? Are these portrayals in the Old Testament plainly wrong or distorted and in need of significant reinterpretation? This appears to be Boyd's position, and I expect that such a reinterpretation dealing with Old Testament texts will be a major part of his project in the Crucifixion of the Warrior God. Second possible answer, this was right. It is what it appears to be. Israel executed God's command by killing many Canaanites. This is a harsh theology position, and sometimes argues that it is not surprising that God judged and destroyed the Canaanites, but rather that he does not judge and destroy all nations. Now, this is formally correct, but does not provide a satisfactory explanation. In fact, it offers no explanation. Yes, God could strike us all dead and still be just, but this, although true, is beside the point. I'm not indicting God or challenging his sovereignty, but attempting to understand his actions. 3 additions can be made to this approach. The first possible, indeed common addition is that the Canaanites were extraordinarily wicked. And therefore they were singled out for judgment. The conquest is judgment. Not infrequently this argument leads to an exaggeration of Canaanite vice, which goes beyond what the text tells us about them. The abominable practices of the Canaanites were real, but they were practiced rather widely in the ancient Near East, and I certainly don't want to whitewash the portrait. The Canaanites were not good people, but there's a difference between emphasizing and underlining their evil side, which I think is what Scripture does, and painting them as over-the-top evil and worthy of judgment more than any other group at the time. Even if that were true, it would still leave us to wonder why only the Canaanites within the boundaries of Israel were judged and not those further north. More importantly, nothing in the book of Joshua suggests that this judgment or punishment is the reason for the conquest. There are no examples of Canaanite wickedness given. This and other indicators for divine retribution or punishment are simply missing. There are some indications that Canaanite sin was a factor in other places, but it hardly explains the indiscriminate killing that appears to have been ordered by a God who is love. Now, the second addition to this view is the idea of intrusion ethics. God's judgment on sin has been postponed until the end and the last judgment, but in the case of the conquest, so it's argued, it intruded into the present. In a sense, the destruction of the Canaanites is a foretaste of final judgment. That's an interesting idea, but it still leaves me uneasy. It's not just that it fails to explain why it hit this subset of Canaanites, or that the indications that this is indeed meant as judgment are missing. As an answer, it's theologically keen, but what about the fact that it impacted real people, including those Israelites who had to execute God's judgment? How can it be the intrusion of God's final judgment if it was so imperfectly and incompletely executed? Now, the first possible addition to this second answer is the claim of illegal occupation. In this view, the Israelites held the legal title to the land. Therefore, the Canaanites were squatters. It was legitimate to compel them by force to give up the land to its rightful owners. This claim does not hold water. God had indeed promised to give Israel the land, but this does not establish a right to go in and take it. If a church or a Christian organization today feels that God is promising them a certain building, they cannot simply move in. There was nothing illegal or illegitimate about Canaanite residents in Canaan. Right, here's option number 3. This is theology, not history. The theology is projected onto the past, interpreting and idealizing it. Now, this approach takes the text seriously as theology, but not as history. In this approach, the text is understood to seek to glorify God and teach the people of Israel, for instance, to distance themselves from the Canaanites and from Canaanite practices. And in this view, there may well not have been anything like genocide, but I expect many of those listening to this will feel uncomfortable with such a low view of the historicity of Old Testament scripture. Okay, option number 4, this was common practice. This would be an easy solution. If Israel did just as the other nations did at the time, it would be a case of accommodation. God condones, then corrects and redirects in the progression of salvation history. But is this the case? It begs the question, what was common practice? This would need to be established through historical evidence, and so far I have not seen such evidence. Cherem appears to go beyond what others did. Option 5, this was Yahweh war. Often referred to as holy war, but the essence is not that it is a holy activity, but rather that it is God's, not Israel's war, although Israel may be called upon to play a role in this war. In the ancient world, it was not uncommon for a nation to think it was fighting a war for or with its God. The strength of this approach is that it takes the conceptual framework and the worldview of the ancient Israelites seriously. It helps us to understand how the Israelites may have understood the conquest. However, it does not really help us today to understand its morality. Option 6. This needs to be reinterpreted spiritually. In the light of the New Testament, that is. The real conflict is with spiritual powers. The true enemy is Satan. What needs to be overcome is evil. The Canaanites embody or symbolize the true opponents. The war of the conquest is a type or symbol of our battle with evil. Now, I'm sure that such a spiritual reinterpretation is the correct application of conquest texts. But it does not help me to come to terms with the historical reality that it described. Joshua's war was not metaphorical or spiritual only, but real and bloody. Answer 7 says this is hyperbole, deliberate, exaggeration. The language of Joshua is theological and hyperbolic. Also, the relevant statements in the Torah are hyperbole. Joshua is not meant to be understood as a factual, down-to-earth historical report. There'll be more to say on the book of Joshua, its type of literature, its language, and so forth, and I hope to do so in the next video. It may be questioned whether this is sufficient as an explanation. I do think it's part of it. There is indeed hyperbole and theology, but it still leaves us with the question, did God order this? And if yes, how can that be? Then answer number 8 is God has his reasons and he may not have communicated them to us. I'm not yet ready to accept this answer. I want to at least try and see if more understanding is possible. A brief survey of some relevant material in the Torah. What did God actually command? Well, interestingly, the earliest commandments, speaking of cherem, do not refer to the Canaanites and do not in every case imply destruction. These 3 verses, whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be cherem, but no devoted thing that a man devotes to the Lord of anything that he has, whether man or beast or of his inherited field, shall be sold or redeemed. Every devoted thing is most holy to the Lord. No Canaanite here. No one devoted, who is to be devoted, who is to be cherem, from mankind shall be ransomed. He shall surely be put to death. Here there is death implied. And then every devoted thing, every cherem in Israel shall be yours, that is, shall belong to the priests. This illustrates it is not easy to fully comprehend Israel's concept of cherem. It was part of a larger conceptual framework that was already in place earlier on, perhaps long before the Canaanites came into view. It also shows the cultic connotation of the idea. Equally interesting are the earliest appearances of cherem in narrative reports. It turns out Israel practiced the form of cherem that we know from the Conquest before Moses had said anything about it, and in cases where God had not commanded it. Does this imply the Israelites knew this practice quite apart from God's revelation on the way to the Promised Land? Something that would make it easier to see it as a form of accommodation? Now, the first occurrence is in Numbers 21, when the king of Arad attacks Israel, and Israel vows to place Arad's cities under cherem if God gives them victory. Notice that God did not ask them for this, and he certainly didn't command it. Also in Numbers 21, we read about the victories over Sihon and Og, but there's no reference here to anything like cherem. It's only when Moses recounts the events in Deuteronomy chapter 2 and 3 that he speaks of this as cherem, claiming we left no survivors. But in this case too, nothing indicates that God had commanded cherem. And then God does order vengeance on the Midianites in Numbers 31, but he does not include cherem. He does not speak of cherem. And when the men of Israel bring women and children as a spoil of war to the camp, Moses gets angry and orders them to kill all of them, except the women who are still virgins. But notice again that God does not speak at this point. The command is that of Moses. There are several passages before Deuteronomy that speak about what Israel is to do when it enters the land. And again, if you want the full references, go to the website at lorentz.org. I won't list them here. The interesting thing is these passages do not use the term cherem, but they do include a commandment to destroy using a different verb. Interestingly, however, what the Israelites are to destroy is the Canaanite gods and altars. The Canaanites themselves, they are to drive out. So where is God's command to execute cherem on the Canaanites? The only direct instruction to do so appears in 2 verses in Deuteronomy that we'll look at next. When the Lord your God gives them over to you and you defeat them, then you must cherem them, devote them to complete destruction. You shall make no covenant with them and show no mercy to them. That's Deuteronomy 7 verse 2. But as all of Deuteronomy 7 is read instead of only these 1 or 2 verses, we do not get the idea that Moses is urging genocide, but rather radical separation from the Canaanites and their ways, which may imply that cherem here does not mean kill and destroy. The call for separation, as here, make no covenant with them, and also elsewhere in this chapter, not to intermarry with the Canaanites, makes no sense if the Canaanites are expected to be killed off entirely. Then the second verse, Deuteronomy 20, but in the cities of these peoples that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance, you shall save alive nothing that breathes, but you shall devote them to complete destruction. Again, there's cherem, and then lists the nations, as the Lord your God has commanded. Notice it's only in this second passage that this command is ascribed to God. We do not find a single instance in the Torah in which God is reported to speak this command directly. And there's only 1 verse in which Moses states, here, that this is what God commanded. That's more than nothing, but it's not much. We run into a fundamental exegetical issue here. Not everything that the Bible records is right and good, since it also records statements and actions that are obviously wrong, often enough without explicitly pointing this out. Elsewhere, even Moses says and does things that are wrong. Is that the way out? It's not obvious to me that this is the case here and that we are expected to mistrust the claim of Moses that God commanded this. I'm therefore not sure that this could be a way out of the moral dilemma, but is at least thinkable. Moses may have rhetorically overstated. In a future issue, I hope to explore what the book of Joshua adds to this picture. As far as the Torah is concerned, this is it. There can be no doubt that, according to the biblical record, Israel practiced cherem. But did God order them to do this? This is less obvious.
The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience. The show will be starting in just a few moments. Thank you for your patience.